Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to class. Last week, just as a bit of a slight review here, it was actually 2 weeks ago, we discussed just a little bit about what the first quarter of the class was, which I taught last year, and it's a continuation of the Hydroplate Theory. But I kind of got on a little bit of a tangent here. I kind of got to thinking that it would be important to talk a little bit more about why I think a study like this is important, not only of the flood, the Great Flood, but really creation science in general. And this is something I found a video that was kind of really inspired me to do this by Stephen Meyer. Now, Stephen Meyer is an author who is one of the more prominent creationist authors, or really not creationist. Actually, he's an advocate of what's called the intelligent design theory. And so we talked about a little bit about intelligent design last week. And basically, just as a quick review here, it's based on a standard method of scientific reasoning that's based on the tenets of science. It's not something that necessarily is faith-based. It's not really faith-based. It's really based on science first. And it has faith or religious implications to intelligent design. But this is kind of what his video was really about. And so what he found too is that there's a lot of things going on in our culture, and it appears that our culture's obviously got a lot of problems. And there's, as we went through this last time we were together, we see rises in teen suicides and anxiety and mass shootings and breakdown of the family and births out of wedlock. And this belief in gender fluidity and leading to medical mutilation of children. It's really despicable. And there's increased promiscuity and legitimacy and abortion, crime waves and fentanyl and many other different problems. So he starts looking at what was the reason for this. Is there kind of a reason why this is all happening in increasing rates? And so he comes to the conclusion here, or comes to the linking of this, is does this have something to do with our declining belief in God? And so there was a Gallup poll that has noted over the last 10 years or so the U.S. belief in God has dipped to a new low of only 81%. And this is about a 10% drop from what it was just only a few years ago. And this started in about 2010, as you see on this chart. You see this, I'll show you the chart in a second here, but there's been a drop, pretty significant one. So this is the chart that he shows, and so this shows that the general belief in God tends to be in the above 90% range for quite a long time. So you go back to about 1945, and then you watch this chart up until about 2010. It stays pretty steady above 90%. Now that's quite a high number. In fact, I was kind of surprised at that. I didn't think belief was even that high. But of course, not everybody who believes that there is a God really acts upon that and really does much about it. But they found that there was this big drop. So they're trying to figure out what's going on here. So they looked at the data on this and found that it's the Gen Zs and those in about the 18 to 30-year-old range that are primarily responsible for this big drop. So we've seen a big drop, unfortunately, in that age group, which has caused this overall drop. And so started to figure out, well, why? Why is this happening this way? Why is a belief in God dropping so rapidly in this age group? And so they started to do some polling of people in this group to find out what was going on. And in the survey they conducted of this 18 to 30-year-olds, they found that 65% of those in this age group who describes themselves as atheists, in other words, that's someone without any belief in God at all, and also 43% of those who describe themselves as agnostic believe that the findings of science make the existence of God less probable. And so Myers then goes on to state, they're not really surprised by this. So they're seeing the findings of science is what's causing some of this drops. And so they also uncovered another top factor of the recent decline, is that they believe that unguided evolution of life had led more people to reject a belief in God, even over those who were worried about disease or suffering or even death. So young people in increasing numbers are coming to this line of thinking, and it's obvious that the constant promotion of evolution has played a large factor in this. This is where I think we can come in. The claim of these atheists is that science somehow has proven God is, we don't need God. That somehow science has come to that point where God's no longer necessary. However, true scientific observation, I think, as we're going to look at when we look at creation science, can show that there's ample scientific evidence that shows that there's an intelligence. There's an intelligence behind the universe, and that intelligence, of course, is the God we worship. So intelligent design doesn't really rely on scripture or specifically specify who the intelligent designer is, but there's also advocates of intelligent design who are creationists, of course, and especially our young earth creationists like I am. I believe the universe was created about 7,000 years ago. And I'm going to show you some evidence of that, scientific evidence of that too, as we go through the class. And you do also get that from a straightforward reading of Scripture. When you read Scripture, it's pretty obvious if you read it as it's written, and you take the timelines in the Bible. We're talking thousands of years here, not hundreds of thousands, not millions, not billions for sure. So intelligent design, Myers goes on to also say, is not really a new idea. It's actually really an old idea. It's an ancient idea. It's been around a long time. It has also new and modern manifestation based on new scientific discoveries over the last 60 or 70 years or so that I think have also confirmed that there's an intelligence behind all the complexities that we find in the universe. But being an older idea, it goes all the way back to early Greeks and the Roman philosophers. But it also has a foundational idea, or was a foundational idea, during what's called the scientific revolution, which happened beginning around the year 1500, and continued into the 1600s and even the 1700s, when a great number of the early scientists that were out at that time assumed that the universe had been designed by a rational intelligence, and if nature had been designed by a rational mind, then we should find evidence of that in nature. So when we study nature, we should find evidence of this. And he states several examples of this. One is Johannes Kepler. He was a German astronomer, a mathematician, an astrologer, and a philosopher, and he was a key figure in the 17th century scientific revolution. And he discovered the laws of planetary motion in our solar system, and he also saw evidence of a rational mind behind the mathematical harmony of the laws that govern our solar system. And he wrote this. This is really a telling quote here about his joy in the observation of creation. He says, "I thank thee, my Creator and my Lord, that thou hast given me this joy in thy creation, this thrill in the works of thy hand. I have made known thy glory to men as far as my limited spirit can grasp thine infinitude." I think this is precisely how we should feel about creation and about what God's done for us. I mean, it should thrill us. It should excite us. We should be in awe of this. So he felt, of course, that he saw design and an intelligence in the universe. And it's not only that God had the ability to design it, but he's also got the power to bring it into existence. I mean, it starts to put me, at least, more in awe of what God has done, and we should have joy in this. I mean, this should bring joy to us when we consider what he's done. Another great scientist from the scientific revolution was Robert Boyle, and he lived from 1627 to 1691. And he's largely regarded today as the first modern chemist, and therefore one of the founders of modern chemistry. And he was also one of the pioneers of the modern experimental scientific method, which is a tenet of science today. In addition to his work in chemistry, he devoted much of his time also to theology, believing that the natural world can provide powerful evidence for the existence of God using the concept of design in nature. that revealed God's involvement in the world. And throughout his career, he tried to show that science could lend support to Christianity. He also spent large sums of money promoting the spread of Christianity, especially in the East. And he contributed liberally to missionaries and to the expenses of translating the Bible, or portions of it, into many languages. And he was a pioneer of studying races, and he believed that all human beings, no matter how diverse the physical differences are, all came from the same source, came from Adam and Eve. Of course, this is what the Bible tells us. We are all from Adam and Eve. Eve is even called the mother of all the living in Scripture. Of course, evolutionary theory points a much different picture of this regarding races, and that Darwin wrote that some races were more evolved than other races, and therefore some races were more human than other races. This had led to tremendous amounts of racism at the time, just after Darwin's writings. And that's, again, there's really no such thing as different races. It's a social construct based on a few outward physical features like skin color and hair color and eye shape. So, it's just false. Then Isaac Newton, he was another key figure in the scientific revolution era, and he was a mathematician, a physicist, an astronomer, an alchemist. He's also a theologian, an author, and inventor. Now, he's got quite a resume there. He contributed to also and refined the scientific method, and his work is considered to be most influential in bringing forth modern science. And he also saw evidence of design in the match between the optical properties of light and the structure and design of the eye. So they were designed to work together, right? He built the first reflecting telescope and developed a sophisticated theory of color based on the observation that a prism separates white light into the different colors of light in the spectrum. And so he made the theoretical calculation of the speed of sound, and his work regarding prisms became an integral part of the development of tunable lasers. Then he had this to say. He's been called the father of modern physics, and he wrote this about he wrote the following. He says, "Gravity explains the motions of the planets, but it cannot explain who set the planets in motion. God governs all things, and he knows all that is or can be." Pretty amazing. From this we can see that Newton built his ideas about God and intelligent design into the very structure of his scientific work. One of the greatest works he ever wrote was called the Principia, and it is considered to be one of the greatest works of physics ever written. He wrote through the Principia what's called a general scholium, and the general scholium basically refers to a specific commentary or note in the text that appears in the Principia. So in it he writes this. He said, "It refers to the orbits of the planets in our solar system, and though these bodies may indeed continue in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have been first derived the regular position of the orbits themselves from those laws. Thus, the most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent, powerful being." So this goes on and on. There are lots of scientists of that era that felt this way. And the reason I want to talk to you about this is there was a big major change that happened. Many of these foundational figures from the scientific revolution and onward were very deeply religious. And they saw God's hand in creation, and they did this for the glory of God. And as Psalms 19:1 says, it states, "The heavens declare the glory of God." And a list of these other famous scientists that would have been in that same era would have been Galileo, and Pascal, and Descartes, and Lord Kelvin, and Francis Bacon. There were a number of others too. And they viewed science and faith as being compatible. And then later on, figures like Mendel and Faraday and Maxwell came along, and they had the same ideas. They followed this same concept of, hey, there's an intelligent design, there's something behind the science that we see. So the early scientists were believers. Okay, I guess is really what I want to talk to you about here. They saw that there was a rational intellect, and this was a founding premise of modern science. Now, fast forward a little bit here. Beginning in the mid to late 1800s, there began to be a major shift. This began with the writings of Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, along with revisionist historians who began to recast the previous history of science, creating a myth that there was a war between religion and Christianity and science. And this myth continues to today. This is what's been going on. The atheistic community today makes constant claims that science and religion are at war with each other, and also make the claim that no qualified scientists believe in God or biblical creation. So I guess the question would be, do they think that Newton and Faraday and Boyle and all these great scientists of the past, do they think they were idiots? I mean, basically, I don't really understand that. From this line of thinking, it spawned the line of thinking now being promoted, or has been promoted, by a group of prominent atheists that became known collectively as the New Atheists. And they will say things like, if you believe in an intelligent designer or God, you're an idiot, or you're stupid, or you're a science denier. This is what we're up against. They will say that all smart people believe in evolution, and openly disparage anyone who does not agree with their evolutionary theory. They will argue that there's a scientific consensus regarding evolution, but it's really an attempt to suppress any dissent within the evolutionary community. Whenever they claim, of course, scientific consensus, it really should serve as a red flag that they are, suppressing any dissent from this view. Atheists claim that there's a lack of evidence supporting the belief in God. To demand the same burden of proof for religious claims be for scientific ones, and finding the lack of testable evidence for God disqualifies them from being real scientists. They constantly frame this as a science versus religion issue, and unfortunately, this has been promoted. And so you remember back to that time frame on that chart we just showed, about 2010? What happened right about that time? Was there something happening that could have contributed, at least contributed to this decline? We see in about 2006 or 2007, there was a publishing genre, that started at that time frame, and it was called the New Atheist publishing genre. And these authors and others started producing a number of books that were highly critical of Christianity and promoted this idea that there was no God. And it said that science basically undermines a belief in God. And I'm telling you right now, this is a lie. And I'm going to tell you, if science is properly understood, it does precisely the opposite. And looking at this chart, you may recognize some of these names of these authors. And they include Richard Dawkins. He's probably the world's most prominent militant atheist that's out there, who says he despises religion, and also who stated openly that his ultimate goal is to eliminate all religions. One of his numerous books is called The God Delusion, and it sold over 3 million copies, and in December of 2006 it reached number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. And he argues in this book that the supernatural creator, which is God, does not exist. So to believe in God qualifies as a delusion. That's the whole idea behind his book. Also in this chart here, you may recognize Lawrence Krauss, the second one there. Now he was formerly of Arizona State University. He's probably America's most prominent atheist today. Also, Stephen Hawking is on this list. Bill Nye, you know him as Bill Nye the Science Guy, which I call him Bill Nye the Unscience Guy. And also Stephen Weinberg. And there's others that probably could be on this list too, like Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and even more. But these authors rose to prominence with their aggressive attacks on religion, promoting that it is unscientific and even arguing that faith is not only irrational, but is harmful to society. So they're claiming that, hey, if you believe in God, this is actually harmful to society. And this publishing boon of these types of books has been kind of prominent ever since. It's maybe starting to wane a little bit at this point. But it's more than just atheism. I mean, they're promoting this. It's more than just, it's more than something casual that they're doing. They're actively, aggressively trying to promote this. Not only their books that have been released, there's also been films produced regarding their beliefs following the April 29, 2013 opening of their documentary film, The Unbelievers, which was at the Toronto's Film Festival. Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss discussed the merits of their approaches of ridding the world of religion. I mean, this is something promoted in this film. So I think it's important for us to kind of know what's going on. This is really the reason why I want to do this, and why I think it's so important for us to understand that it is not a science versus religion thing, and that there is merit to creation science. So I think it's important for us to know what's going on here. They promote something called nihilism, which basically is also known as materialism. It basically just includes the idea God doesn't exist. It also includes the idea man rose gradually from lower animals by mindless, undirected processes. This is evolution. This is exactly what we're talking about. Therefore, the conclusion of that is human beings have no real intrinsic or essential value. Free will is just an illusion. Objective morality is an illusion. In other words, my morality could be different from your morality. There's no objective standards for morality.
Steve,
yes.
If they were consistent in that thought process, that all that leads to is anarchy, because then you can't tell me what I have to believe or what I have to do. And anything I choose to do is okay because it's okay by me.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't care what you think and what society thinks. It's such a flawed. They don't take things to their lack of a better term, natural conclusion, and it's
without an objective morality. I mean, what's right to me is totally different from maybe what you think is right. It's left up to your own opinions rather than having some objective, some standard of morality. It turns out too, and following this line of thinking, life has no purpose. When we die, we rot. That's it. It's over. It turns out that this is a very destructive lie, and this has far-reaching consequences to some who hear this message, and that's where I want to go with this next. One example of this, Meyer then explains in his video as a student story. He explains that he participates in an annual science and faith conference on the East Coast, and he has encounters with many young people who have been taught this false idea that science makes a belief in God less probable, which has led them to doubt and ultimately many to unbelief. And of course, I think when you look at the scientific method, the opposite is really true. But then he goes on to say that every year they do this conference, he has repeatedly had the very same similar experience of having some bereaved father or mother approach him and tell him that when his or her formerly devout son or daughter went off to college, one of those great science universities, and came under the mentorship of some prominent scientific atheist professor, it resulted in not only the child losing their faith in God, and that being disturbing, of course, in and of itself, but even more disturbing, in addition to that, they become hostile. They totally change their personalities, or change their personality somewhat, become very hostile to their families, and they cause stresses within their own families, and even worse sometimes. And he recalls at one of these events several years ago, he was being interviewed, and both he and the interviewer noticed that a camera woman who was filming the event was seen to have been visibly shaken while she was filming this event. She was overcome by emotion. She was weeping and shaking as she filmed this. And she explained later in a letter that she wrote to the person who had employed her to film this event, that this discussion that Meyer was having with this interviewer was talking about the scientific evidences that support God and support creation. And as she was listening to this and filming this, she was learning of these evidences that support a belief in God. And she was so touched by this that she was overcome by her emotions. And Meyer explains that this was because she'd been living in a state of cognitive dissonance. That's her graduation from college. And of course, cognitive dissonance basically is a state in which you are in mental stress or discomfort because you're holding two conflicting ideas or beliefs at the same time. And this causes personal anxiety and tension and even guilt. So in her letter, she writes this, and this is very telling, I think. She writes, throughout my college career, professors would consistently lecture that based on the evidence they had provided, there should be no way that anyone in this class should believe in God. And I'll tell you, this occurs at virtually every college and university that they generally produce or present evolution as if it were a proven fact. And she goes on to say this, they'd argue that science was proven and God was hence a myth. She also says, I was not equipped to present a valid opposition in a debate. I was desperate to find a commonality between my beliefs and my scientific education. The fact that she says that she was not equipped to deal with this is a very, very important point. This is something I firmly believe in. We have to recognize that what's been happening in our schools and in our universities has been going on for decades now. We have to understand what our children are being taught as they go off to these universities. We are allowing, we're seeing now, the unchecked teaching of a false scientific theory. What is really tragic is that we can so easily now, with what we know about science, show it to be false. Evolution is easy to destroy. Now, the evolutionists on their side won't listen to you. They will ignore you, but we can show anybody who has an interest in this by creation science that we can show that there's fantastic scientific evidence, especially what's happened in the last 50 to 100 years or so. But it's so very entrenched in our school systems that I think at the very least we need to make sure our children are prepared with good scientific answers prior to them being sent off to the institutions. Maybe even better yet, we don't send them there. Maybe we just get them out of these places. And there's two creationist organizations, Answers to Genesis and Creation Ministries International, have conducted studies on this very subject, and they have found this is what's going on. They're seeing children or young adults that are heading into the education systems as being brought up in Christian homes are falling away in great numbers as they go through college and high school and college and get out of college. And they're also finding that those that are falling away are those that weren't taught any kind of creation science in their churches. They're finding that those that do stay, many of those do have a bit of a scientific evidence. There was something that made them pause and think, well, no, this is not right. There is some scientific evidence that supports creation. She goes on to say then, too, that she would have gone on to grad school in science, but instead she decided not to do that, and she went into film production instead because her faith had been so shaken. So this is a major change in what she would have done just based on this. So now I got to imagine this on a much larger scale. How many thousands upon thousands of students have encountered the same thing when attending science classes in our high schools and universities? Creationist organizations like Answers to Genesis and Creation Ministries International show the reasons why so many of these Gen Zs are abandoning faith in God, and they've come to the same conclusion about how teaching science, and in particular evolutionary science, has been so damaging to this group of people. So many have struggled with this exact same issue. So one of the comments in this video, it was on YouTube, you have a bunch of comments. So I started reading through some of the comments. And there was one that was so particularly sad that I really wanted to include it here. So you can see there's really a dark side to this line of thinking. So in reading the comments here, I found this one. It reads, I am one of those bereaved parents. He's talking about Myers always gets some bereaved parent that comes and tells him the story. But in the comments it says, I'm one of these bereaved parents. Our first son was born brilliant, funny, a professing Christian, who went off to college planning to study philosophy and history. He became enamored with a certain philosophy teacher who greatly influenced him and mentored him in his 4 years in college. He served 3 combat tours with the Marines, suffered PTSD, became addicted to legal as well as the illegal medications and alcohol, as well as pornography, and all the while embraced what he had learned in his university: nihilism, atheism, Marxism, evolution, etc. As the years passed by, he destroyed his family, his marriage, his health, and finally his mind. Sergeant Danny Finder, USMC, killed himself in 2024. So now, I think we're seeing some linking here between this. I mean, look at what's going on. He was obviously bought into some of this stuff by some professor. And unfortunately, these writings by these new atheists have had some tragic effects. This is not an isolated story. One rather tragic story also is a young man named Jesse Kilgore. He committed suicide in October of 2008. And he also was brought up in a Christian family. And then after leaving the military, he took a biology course at a university from a very aggressive atheistic science professor who challenged his students to read some of these books from the new atheists we just talked about. And so his body, unfortunately, was found in his bedroom. He committed suicide. And under his bed was found a copy of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And in the book, he had written notes in the margins of this book. And according to his father, these notes made it clear that Jesse followed a progression of thought that caused him to abandon his faith. And apparently, in this process, he lost all his hope, leading for him to take his own life. I mean, this is just so tragic. And of course, all those who read these types of books are not going to commit suicide. But I can see where the fruits of this line of thinking could lead some down this path. But if you come to the conclusion that there's not really any meaning to life or any purpose, it can lead to a point of despair in many people. Many who are not equipped to deal with their emotions over an issue like this. And I wish that was only one example. I mean, there's many more. Here's another tragic one. We've seen many cases in the last few decades of mass shootings. It's been documented in many of these cases that there's an underlying philosophical materialism that is involved in these incidences that contain a Darwinian rationale, and that life really doesn't have any meaning. Everybody, I'm sure, remembers the Columbine case. This occurred in 1999, in which 2 students at Columbine High School killed 12 students and a teacher and wounded 23 others before killing themselves. And it became clear that these 2 were deeply depressed. Prior to the shootings, they wrote a manifesto stating that they were helping natural selection law. Now, one of the tenets of Darwinian evolution is that of natural selection. Natural selection basically says the weak should be eliminated and the strong should survive. And he made the case that this is a good thing to advance biology. Eric Harris was one of the shooters who wrote in the manifesto, he wrote this. He says, natural selection, it's the best thing that ever happened to Earth. Getting rid of all those stupid weak organisms. But it's now natural, yes. Tragically, this line of thinking can lead to this type of action from some. And this, again, these are not isolated cases. I'm not going to take the time to go through more of them. But this is the type of thing, the dark thinking that can occur from this kind of thing. And it's why I wanted to take the time to do this. I know I'm off on a little tangent here. But fortunately, there are also some good things that have happened. We've seen some great examples of those who have been saved, who've returned through a turn to Christ. And one video that I also saw, because I was looking into Dawkins, and this video came up, and it shows how a particularly prominent Richard Dawkins supporter and former right-hand man of Dawkins, named Josh Tinneman, actually became a faithful follower of Jesus upon hearing the message of Jesus and the historical facts that support a belief in God. And he was originally persuaded to atheism upon reading one of Dawkins' books. He was in a rock band and he was traveling. One of Dawkins' books was on the back seat of this car, and he asked about it. And somebody else says, well, your mom wouldn't want you to read that. Of course, that made him want to read it all the more. But he wrote, and he read this book. Dawkins argued that materialism was all there is, and that evolutionary science proves it. And therefore, it cuts God and the idea of creation. Dawkins, of course, he thinks God, anybody believing in God is an idiot and delusional. And Josh originally felt a pull toward these ideas proposed by Dawkins and others, and he describes himself at the time wanting a more secular life. with less restrictions, because that's something people do. Oh, these Christians, they have all these restrictions on them. So he wanted this. He didn't want to be under somebody's authority. That seems to be a big problem with a lot of people who reject Christianity. He had once been brought up in the church, though, and then he explains it as he read this book. He started to become an atheist, and it changed his worldview in many ways. And he did not think there was an afterlife. He said, this is it. As a result, he began to feel that the future was bleak, and due to this, he explains that he started to feel terrible about it. He says that he was first introduced to drinking at this time and having fun, and that these factors shifted him more and more toward an atheistic life. And he was so influenced by Dawkins, he contacted Dawkins and offered to develop a website for Dawkins. And Dawkins accepted this, and it led him to becoming more and more involved with Dawkins, and eventually he started promoting Dawkins and filming documentaries featuring Dawkins. But at the same time, he also described an emptiness that he was experiencing. He spoke of the birth of his daughter during this time, who was very premature. The doctors had prepared he and his wife for the possibility that she wasn't going to make it, and they may lose the child. And he recalls the feeling at that time, it was ever at a time he wanted to pray, this was it. I mean, but he was an atheist, and said, I was not praying to anybody. He says, I did not have strong feelings about this child. He did have strong feelings about his child that didn't really square with evolutionary ideas. He said this child was the most important thing to him. But his atheism logically told him to believe that the child's just another creature is going to die like him, so what does it really matter? He realized that the atheist point of view can easily discount the value of life, and he wrestled with that. And he moved to Portland, Oregon in 2020. This was at the center of all this chaos and all the riots that happened during that time frame. And it got him thinking about a moral compass. And where does that come from? He thought he aligned with these people, but then he realized that they were trying to control others by using evil by any means, and he said it really shocked him. Then he began to think that the supernatural was something that needed to be considered. And it led him and his wife to actually get out of Oregon and move to Texas. He describes in Texas a totally different culture. He said he found people talking about faith, talking about church, then actually attending church. Okay, he actually started to attend a church. And he said something about, well, here, me, I'm in church? I mean, he says, this is the last place I should be. But he also saw those who were standing against the tyranny, against the culture. They saw that they were the Christians that were doing that. And then he looked deeper into who Jesus was, and discovered who Jesus was. He said, what he says is that he also started studying, looking at the historical evidence that supported Christ. And this eventually led him to accept Christ. And so the main reason I want to tell you about this is that all this scientific evidence of origins points directly toward creation. And this is how powerful, I think, how important this is. We can do this. It's up to us. Okay? The schools are not going to do it. The atheistic evolutionary community is not going to do it. We have to do this. We have to stand up, basically. So, again, sorry to take that little detour, but I wanted to do that because I wanted to really help us understand just how important I think this kind of information is. So I personally believe this information will cover in this class. We're going to go on now more with the flood, get back to that. And all these mysterious features that we see in the earth today do point back to a single event, a great flood, exactly as described in Scripture. There's much more to this than just a flood, which I've covered in other classes, but I believe this is such an important topic I wanted to dedicate this entire class to studying the flood. So in the first weeks of the class, we discovered the importance of this topic. I said the Hydroplate Theory is the flood model that I think is biblically and scientifically sound. And we went into discussing the initial assumptions and initial conditions of the Hydroplate Theory. Basically, the initial assumption is that when God created the earth, in Genesis 1, 6 through 8, there was a separation of waters above and waters below by something called a rakia. And the rakia basically means a plating, or it's a root word of raka, which means to cover or plate something. And if that's the case, there would have been surface waters with a granite crust, and then waters trapped below that crust. And this is referenced in other scripture as well. Back to this. If that's true, if that's correct, then the hydroplate theory is the correct theory as far as the flood theory. And so we'll see as we go through this that there's causes and effects that perfectly match, that there would have been trapped subterranean water created that way when the world was created in Genesis 1:6 through 10. We'll see that this is where the water comes from to flood the earth. When Genesis 7 says the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So, if you had my handout from before, I sent you've got one here. Thanks, David, for bringing that back. I want to talk about the different phases of the flood. And the first part of the flood is called the rupture phase. And I'm going to go through chronologically what happens during the different phases of the flood. The first thing that we want to cover here is the formation or the origin of comets, asteroids, meteors, and interstellar dust, and what are called trans-neptunian objects, or TNOs for short. So I'm glad we call them TNOs, because who wants to remember trans-neptunian objects, right? Also included in this section that we'll be going through is an explanation of the mysterious features on the moon. And there's evidence that it received 5 extremely major impacts to the surface of the moon, interestingly, which all appear to have originated from the direction of Earth. And I'll show you some slides on that. Fantastic. And the hydroplate theory proposes an origin of these space objects that is totally different than mainstream evolutionary theory, which only speculates again on their origins. And again, the evolutionary speculations are guesses and based on imagination. And this is all too familiar, an all too familiar aspect when you uncover and you look deeply into evolutionary theory. It's a theory based on guesses and hunches and a preconceived starting assumption that excludes any supernatural. And therefore, evolutionary theory is an assumed error that there's no supernatural creator, and then it leads only to the logical conclusion that everything happens by random chance. And it's on this initial error that they start from the wrong starting point that leads to more and more complex errors on top of more complex errors, and error after error after error, all going back to this same starting point. And such again is the case here when you start looking at these origins of these objects in the solar system. So in the evolutionary scenario, the textbooks will give 2 possible explanations for the origins of these objects. This is there are either the remains of an exploded planet, or a planet that failed to evolve completely. Just to let something, a planet was going to evolve, but it didn't come together. But experts in the field recognize that there are significant problems with both of these explanations, and they're puzzled. For example, the most popular explanation today for the origin of asteroids is that they are bodies that did not merge to become a planet. But never explained is how, in the nearly empty vacuum of space, matter merged to become these rocky bodies in the first place. Why rocky bodies started to form a planet, but stopped. So why would they start to form and then it just stopped? Well, why it happened primarily between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, where the vast majority of the asteroids are. So when we get into asteroids, you'll find that they're made up of clumps of rock, different rocks that have come together. Is this some planet that started to form and all of a sudden stopped? These are the kind of questions and things, they're just vague explanations by the evolutionary community. They just don't have any answers for this. But they're so committed to materialism that they won't consider anything else. They also complain that they can't really explain how any planets will form. Orbiting rocks do not merge to become planets or asteroids because clouds of gases and dust will expand away from each other under normal conditions in outer space. Today, collisions and fragment and scatter asteroids, just the opposite of this failed planet explanation. During the 4.6 billion years evolution say asteroids have existed, asteroids would have had so many collisions that they should be much more fragmented than they are today. I heard the bell, and we gotta quit. I want to keep going.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.